Welcome to Cherry Bekaert's Industrial Manufacturing Podcast. We're excited to continue our latest series titled Building a Competitive Recovery, where we will discuss the challenges of this COVID recovery landscape and provide strategies to position your business for future success. I'm Matt Brady, leader of the firm's Industrial Manufacturing Industry Group. Today, I'm joined by Ron Wainwright, a lead partner in our Strategic Tax Advisory Group. Ron joins me today to discuss the final part of our series on how manufacturers can utilize various tax strategies to offset expansion cost. Welcome, Ron.
Thanks, Matt. I'm excited to be here.
Well, Ron, we've got a number of things to cover, so let's dive in. As companies are revisiting their supply chain, in particular where they have facilities, we know there are several tax strategies to consider, including cost segregation and 179D. Can you take a few minutes to educate our listeners on these two concepts?
So, Matt, these traditional planning opportunities, we hope that all of our industrial clients have taken advantage of. But to highlight, cost segregation is an opportunity for manufacturers to look at their facilities from a structural analysis perspective and determine what property is 1250, which causes that property to be capitalized and then depreciated over 39 and a half years. And then what property in my facility is what is referred to as 1245 property, or in essence, non-structural property, which allows me to use the IRS class life to potentially put or determine my class life at 15 years or less. So 5, 7, 10, 15, even as low as 3. So what does this do for our clients? It allows you then to utilize the provision of bonus depreciation that came in the Tax Cuts Jobs Act of 2017 and immediately expense that property. So cost segregation is in fact a timing planning opportunity. It's very important as you can accelerate your depreciation 15 years into one tax year in the current year. 10 years into the one tax year in the current year. So significant opportunity there. We further often see our clients taking advantage appropriately of the energy efficiency deduction, a standard which came into law in what was referred to as the Energy Policy Act of 2005, standing for a facility being energy efficient and thereby allowing the taxpayer to be eligible for up to $1.80 a square foot of a deduction, which would remove 39-year depreciation down into an immediate year. There are what are referred to as ASHRA standards with respect to 179 Cap D, but two very important planning opportunities as we see U.S. companies bringing more and more jobs back into the United States.
That's great, Ron, and certainly to your point, I think notating those being traditional, I think both have been there, been available, and so I know we've utilized those for a number of our clients. So, of course, tax law wouldn't be interesting unless it were regularly changing. So recognizing we do have pending legislation, I guess my first part of my question is, should we expect either of these traditional tax strategies to be eliminated or otherwise expanded? And then the second part of that is thinking to the concept of onshoring. Can you speak briefly to the new 10% onshoring credit?
So both of the cost segregation and 179 Cap D are going to be very important planning opportunities for our clients as we look forward. There will be no dramatic change from a cost segregation perspective. However, I would highlight that just last week, the Treasury finalized the final regulations underneath qualified improvement property, which was a change that was made in the CARES Act underneath a section called 168E, which allowed for qualified improvement property to be immediately expensed as well. So when we think about cost segregation and the expansion of it, we should be looking at structural, non-structural. What are the 263 tangible property regulations tell us that we can expense under a unit of property concept? And then in turn, what are we doing in the facility that could potentially qualify for qualified improvement property that was changed most recently underneath the CARES Act? When we think about 179 Cap D, the proposed legislation actually expands the energy efficiency deduction from the $1.80 up to $3 a square foot. So again, what it allows the taxpayer to do is once you've done a structural and non-structural analysis, structural being that 39.5-year straight line property, the 179 Cap D allows you to then take gross square footage potentially by $3 a square foot, and then in turn immediately expense that in the current taxable year. Very, very important. As you mentioned, there is a significant provision in the pending tax legislation, as there are many. But the one that we are monitoring for our manufacturing clients is what is referred to as the tax incentive for locating jobs and business activity back to the United States. It would actually allow for a 10% credit on eligible cost, whereby a multinational client is making a determination in the supply chain, because we know there's been breakage and we know there's been contraction in the supply chain. As they bring jobs back to the United States, that is a 10% credit for those eligible expenses in relocating those jobs back to the United States. In doing so, obviously, there will be a significant opportunity to expand facilities, take advantage of the energy efficiency provisions, and a number of other planning opportunities that exist in the current pending legislation.
That's great, Ron. Appreciate that. And maybe I'll throw over my last question, and that's just really as we think about what's been available, what may be available. What should our listeners be thinking about before year end in relation to their facilities, capex, or just overall spend?
Well, this will come across as somewhat abnormal tax planning, but I think we're all familiar, those that are listening to the podcast, that we have two major pieces of legislation in Washington, D.C., the infrastructure bill of about 1.2 trillion, and then of course the budget resolution that could be upwards of 3.5. Within that, we know that tax rates will increase, whether you're a C corporation moving from 21 to proposed 26.5, or if you're an individual moving from literally 37% now upwards of about 46.4%. So as you evaluate your capex towards year end, recognize that effective January 1 of 22, that placed in service date becomes more and more critical, because obviously a deduction in the 22 taxable year is worth a lot more than it is in the current rate structure at 21% for corporations or 37% through pass-throughs. So a little bit abnormal planning. But we'll be doing another podcast talking about kind of the top 15 year-end tax planning opportunities for industrial manufacturers. But when you focus on year-end, really take into consideration, if I'm going to be in that November-December window, does it make sense from a capex perspective to place my asset in service in January of 22 and take advantage of the rate arbitrage?
That's great, Ron. Thank you. And obviously, as we're sitting here, we know we're in fourth quarter, and that means we have time, but we recognize time will move quickly. So essentially, starting to think about those strategies now is key. For all of our listeners, we hope this conversation provides you with some creative solutions for offsetting your expansion expenses through the current available tax strategies or the ones we gave you a sneak preview of as it relates to tax legislation. Additional guidance regarding the subjects mentioned today can be found in the related guidance section of this podcast webpage. Please visit cbh.com/guide for more. We hope you were able to join us for all parts of our series on building a competitive recovery. It has been a pleasure to dive into the various growth strategies manufacturers can leverage in this post-COVID landscape. If you missed any part of the series, we invite you to go back to take a listen. To recap, in part 1, we discussed using digital strategies to optimize supply chain. Part 2 focused on the impact of international tax changes on your supply chain efficiency. Part 3 highlighted the challenges of utilizing vertical integration to ease supply chain challenges. And then in part 4, we discussed the benefits new market tax credits can bring to your growth strategy. Thanks again for joining us, and thank you, Ron, for your time today.